Thanks everyone for bearing with us. Sorry for those online, but hopefully, according to the thumbs up, I'm assuming you can all hear us now and we're all good. It's my pleasure today to introduce Laura Bussolini. She's been doing her PhD with us since before the pandemic on one of Australia's most rare species, the orange-bellied parrot. In the interest of time, I'm just going to head straight over to let her get started. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Dee. Sorry for the technology delays, but I think we're up and running now. Right. So my name is Laura. The first thing I'd like to do is start by acknowledging the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and also the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional custodians on the land where we meet today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. As Dee mentioned, I'm with the Difficult Bird Research Group down in Hobart. I started in 2020, so the early days of the pandemic, which means I did half my PhD in some form of lockdown, which is probably why I'm not very familiar to many of you. Today, I'm presenting my final seminar. The title of my thesis is Captive Breeding as a Tool for Species Conservation. I've been working with the Tasmanian state government on the orange-bellied parrot program since 2016, and I have a background both in animal husbandry and working with released populations in the field. So I'm really interested in the confluence of these two spaces, and I'm primarily using OBPs as a case study to answer my research questions. The first thing I want to discuss is general terminology, and then I'll get into the structure of my thesis. So I primarily use the phrase captive breeding, although I also use the phrase conservation breeding. Sometimes you see zoo bred or zoo breeding programs. These are all forms of ex situ management. This is a very broad term, but the phrase ex situ is relating to managing populations outside of their natural systems. So it can be something like a breeding program, but also insurance populations or seed banks, for example. The opposite of that, of course, is in situ management, and this is referring to populations living within their natural systems. In this context, it could be a wild population or a reintroduced population. Speaking of reintroduced, we've got releases, relocations, reintroductions, supplementation. These terms are generally used relatively interchangeably, although they do mean slightly different things. But overall, what we're talking about here are translocations. Translocation simply referring to transferring individuals from one location to another, could be captive or wild. So even though I just explained that these are broad terms, I think that within the conservation context, the classic example of, or at least what most people think of, is breeding animals in captivity for eventual release to the wild. And on paper, this probably seems like a great idea. You breed animals safely in captivity, then you let them go. What could possibly go wrong? Well, these programs can face a lot of different challenges. In general, just a lack of information, right? Has anyone worked with this particular species before? Is there good information available? Next, getting individuals to breed in captivity can be extremely challenging. Also, there might be some sort of adaptation to a captive environment that is deleterious after release. Once individuals are released, they need to survive. And unfortunately, post-release survival can be extremely low. So overall, these programs represent a significant long-term investment, and there is no guarantee of success. So these challenges sort of from start to finish are really what inspired the structure of my PhD thesis. Because of that, there's sort of a temporal element to my chapters, sort of what are the steps that you would need to take and what are the areas that you might need to research if you were trying to understand how a captive breeding program could potentially contribute to species conservation. And you wanted to inform those decisions with evidence and sort of progress through that process. So as I mentioned, a good place to start is to do research to understand what has been done before. So my first chapter is a literature review. The next challenge is getting animals to breed in captivity. So my second chapter is specifically looking at factors that influence reproductive success for orange-bellied parrots. Third, you need to make sure that there are no deleterious adaptations to a captive environment and you're giving these animals the best possible start in life. My third chapter is therefore about nestling growth and how that relates to survival. Once they are released, you want these animals to survive and learn all of the skills that they need to survive in the wild. So my fourth chapter is specifically on parrot social structure after release. And my final chapter, I wanted to understand how information learned from some of these long-running programs can be applied to decision-making and future planning. So my final chapter is a PVA for a different species, the swift parrot, to start examining how a captive breeding program could potentially contribute to species recovery. So I'm going to get into all of these chapters. I do have 5, so I'm going to be a little light on details because I'm conscientious of time. So my first chapter is a scoping review of the literature, where I'm primarily focused on species where some form of ex situ conservation and reintroductions have been instrumental in preventing extinction. As I mentioned, I felt like this is a good place to start, kind of understanding what is available in the literature, what's been done before, and especially how successful programs are operating. To start, I want to explain how reintroductions and translocations are represented in the literature a little more broadly. Many of the basic trends I found during this review came primarily from the 3 sources listed at the bottom of the slide. And this context is really important for framing because conservation translocations in particular are often carried out with captive animals. And this is obviously one half of our captive breeding for release as a strategy. The general consensus I found across authors and through time is that reintroductions in general are poorly documented in the literature. The literature tends to be fragmented and descriptive. There's overall a lack of hypothesis testing. The results and the purpose of the translocations are rarely stated. This means that assessing the success or evaluating the effectiveness of different strategies can be very difficult. They're generally carried out in an ad hoc fashion and are not closely monitored. There's an overall lack of planning, small sample sizes, and a lack of statistical controls, and very few report on the costs of these programs. This is a quote I found from a 2019 review on conservation translocations, which reads, quote, "Translocations are a common conservation and management strategy, but they are a high-cost endeavor with a history of failures." So this is not a particularly encouraging start. Why do we keep persisting with this strategy? Well, I was thinking that someone somewhere must be doing this successfully, right? But again, how do we define success? I found this paper from 2020, which investigates how conservation actions have prevented extinction. So I thought that extinction prevention might be a good general definition of quote unquote success. This particular paper argues that from 1993 through to 2020, conservation actions prevented the extinction of somewhere between 21 and 32 species of bird. I used their data set and I filtered it to species specifically where ex situ conservation and reintroduction were listed as key conservation actions. And those are the official terms that are used by the IUCN planning groups. This generated a list of 15 bird species. So here they all are. We've got 15 species of bird, a range of taxonomic groups from all over the world, where according to the paper I just cited, some form of ex situ conservation and reintroductions, among other conservation actions, have been associated with the persistence of these species in the wild over the last 30 years. I wanted to focus again on these quote unquote successful programs as a subset of the literature so we could understand what is being published in this space, because if captive breeding and releases can be an effective strategy, these are the programs that would arguably be publishing about it. And this information is really important, both to kind of understand what's been done previously, what's worked, what hasn't worked, so we can determine the effectiveness of different actions and also how those same techniques might be applied elsewhere. So to do this, I conducted a scoping review of the literature. A scoping review is a method of research analysis where the literature is systematically collated and summarized, which allows us to kind of map the literature on a given topic. And by centering the review around individual species, this really allows us to highlight areas where research has been emphasized and also corresponding gaps. So to do this, I ran searches on Web of Science and Scopus. My search terms were very simply the scientific name or the common name for each species. This means I ran 15 literature searches across both platforms. As you can imagine, that generated a lot of results, just over 1,500, of which luckily most were duplicates, but we had 645 relevant peer-reviewed publications. Within those 645 papers, I then basically asked 3 questions. The first thing I wanted to do was just classify information about the paper, especially the major research themes and the studied population. Second, I simply asked, did this paper specifically look at anything to do with ex situ conservation or reintroduction? So a simple yes, no. And then third question, for those that answered yes, in question 2, how did they address some of our specific research themes of interest? And I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. For our first question about the main study population and research themes, this is a chord diagram, which is showing the total count of studies that fell into every category. So in gray at the top, I have broad research themes, so behavior, conservation, demographics, genetics, physiology, and threats. Got a little cut off. The colored portions at the bottom are the studied population. So what population was that particular article studying? The majority, 48%, which is shown in teal here, we're looking at in situ populations. So again, some sort of population that's occurring within a natural system. It could be a wild population or a reintroduced population. Within that population, the themes are relatively evenly split across behavior, demographics, and threats. About 24% of papers studied an ex situ population. So again, ones that are in some sort of managed systems. Often it was a captive population. They're shown in the darker blue, and about 1/3 of those papers are detailing something to do with physiology. This is, for example, health assessments, disease surveillance, but it also included things like veterinary case reports. The purple section, which is 19% of studies, is where the studied population was not specified. So this tended to include review papers, but also a lot of the genetics papers maybe specified they were using GenBank samples, but I couldn't confirm the exact population. The final two in green, I was calling a mixed category, that's 7%. Those are papers that are specifically comparing and contrasting two different populations. So sometimes it was captive and wild, sometimes it was reintroduced and wild, but sort of explicitly comparing. And the little sliver in yellow are studies that are using museum samples. So there is obviously a lot of information and a lot of patterns here, but what's interesting to me is that we have very few studies that are explicitly comparing and contrasting different populations. And again, as someone who's worked kind of on both sides of things, I feel like this is a little bit of a missed opportunity. For my second major question, that was about how many papers out of all 645 are specifically addressing something to do with ex situ conservation and reintroductions directly. So this plot is the total count of papers by species. And over half of papers, 54%, did not mention anything to do with ex situ conservation or reintroductions at all. That's everything in purple. About 16% of papers mentioned these topics, but only provided some basic background information or kind of glanced over it. It might have been 1 or 2 lines in an introduction, for example, and they're everything in blue. 27%, about 1/4 of papers did discuss something to do with ex situ conservation and or reintroduction. So those are the yellow papers in the chart. And then 3% in green kind of fell into the subcategory of modeling, where the paper would model something about reintroductions or captive breeding, but they never actually reported what had been done in the past. So they kind of were working in a hypothetical space. The other major takeaway here is about the numbers. So one obvious thing is that there's a huge disparity in the total number of publications for each species. The second thing is that for 2 species, the mangrove finch and the Mariana crow, where aside from a little bit of background information, none of the papers from our search detailed anything to do with the ex situ conservation efforts for these species. There are 3 more species that only have 2, I think maybe 3 papers. That's the echo parakeet, the Guam rail, and the Lear's macaw. So the overall impact of that finding is that I read all of these papers and I can't tell you anything about how ex situ conservation or reintroductions contributed to the persistence of these species in the wild. And finally, for our third question, that was about, for those papers in the previous slide, that was 194 that were yeses or modeling in the previous slide. How did they address some of our specific themes of interest? And these were really concepts that focused on the mechanics of how these programs work. So on the captive side of things, I was looking for information on adaptations to a captive environment, demographics and behavior, health, something about the history or the establishment of these programs, and also captive husbandry. They're shown in the orange text on this slide. or this side, sorry. On the other side, on the reintroductions, I was looking at papers reporting on the methods of how they conducted the releases, reporting on the actual release events, monitoring techniques, demographics, and behavior. So they're in blue on the opposite side. And then in the middle, just sort of overall, I was interested in the impacts on the population and costs. So they are the two small wedges in the middle. The primary topics that were addressed ended up being demographics and behavior for both the reintroduced and the captive populations. And this makes sense because it kind of became a little bit of a catch-all category, but this is also really relevant research, right? It's things like survival, mortality rates, reproduction, all very important. What was generally not discussed, release methods. You can see we only have about 20 papers that turned up. About 2/3 of those were about modeling releases rather than reporting what had actually been done. We have a handful of papers describing the history or how the captive program was established. We had 3 that reported specific costs or budget estimates. That's the tiny sliver of green in the middle. And then potentially, maybe surprising, we had very few discussing the impact that these programs had on the wild population. I think we returned about 11 papers. So some of the implications from this research, we had 27% of all of our papers specifically address something to do with ex-situ conservations and reintroductions. I can't really say whether that's an appropriate proportion, but we did find 5 species with less than 3 papers. 2 of those had 0 papers related to those topics. I would argue that some of those statements that were put forth by the reviewers on that first slide really seem to stand up over time. We have very few papers reporting methods, detailed experiments, costs, or the impacts. And again, these are the quote unquote successful programs. So if we're looking for evidence that captive breeding and reintroductions or translocations can be an effective way to preserve threatened wild populations, this is hopefully where we would find it. I do argue that this is a problem. This is years of work and resources have been dedicated to preserving these species, yet from reading the peer-reviewed literature, you would have no idea what had been done. This makes it very difficult to assess effectiveness of different strategies, but also utilize population models or inform decisions with evidence. Why is this happening? I think publication bias could always be a factor. There's going to be limited time, money, and resources. That's always going to be an issue. Also, potentially some of this information might be considered sensitive in some capacity. So program managers might not want aspects of that research in the public space. I think there's an argument to be made that the traditional sort of academic publication route might not be the most appropriate forum for a lot of this information, right? We need to acknowledge that when working with critically endangered animals, things like small sample sizes, the difficulty in designing or replicating experiments, and risk-adverse management bodies are going to be inherent issues. But arguably, some of those same concerns make this research that much more important. So this study is really showing that a lot of that information really seems to be missing from the peer-reviewed literature in many ways. And it's mirroring and reinforcing some of those gaps described by the earlier reviewers, saying that arguably these trends have not really changed over the last 25 years. All right, we're going to jump into a little bit of background on orange-bellied parrots. By understanding a little bit of this background, this is going to frame some of my next research chapters and hopefully save me from repeating myself too much. So OBPs, they're a small Neophema. They breed in southwestern Tasmania and migrate to the mainland. They're critically endangered. The currently wild population, I've got at 82 birds. That's the number that returned from their migration at the start of the 23-24 season. They're restricted to a single breeding location at Melaleuca in Tasmania's southwest, and this population has been the subject of intensive management action since the late 1970s. One of those main management actions is the release of captive bred individuals. The captive breeding program started in 1986. Releases started in the early 1990s. Captive population currently houses about 600 birds and has since released over 1,000 individuals. This makes it arguably one of the largest and longest running avian breeding programs in Australia, if not the world. And this long-term data set really provides us with some unique research opportunities to address those other challenges that we had at the start. So jumping straight back into my chapters, right? We've done our background research. Now we actually need to breed birds in captivity. This chapter is specifically looking at some of the variables that can influence reproductive success. For birds, there are a lot of variables that can be contributing related to the individual birds themselves, so their age, their health, their genetics, but also the environment in which birds are housed in. So their enclosures, the type of nest box, temperature, the humidity, and also things related to the specific breeding attempt. So the date the eggs were laid within the season, how many eggs were laid, variations by year. All of this has been demonstrated to impact reproductive success. So I wanted to start examining this system to understand what variables are impactful and also where in the process sort of things were or were not working. To do this, I compiled 11 years of orange-bellied parrot breeding records. It was just over 720 attempts. And I chose to define reproductive success in 4 different ways to gain a level of understanding as to what's happening at each stage of the process. The first thing I wanted to look at was participation. So did they lay eggs? Yes or no? Did those eggs hatch? And did the chicks survive through to fledging? My 4th variable was looking at offspring sex ratio, which isn't so much success, but I was interested in this for 2 main reasons. First is because there had been a history of a female bias in the captive population historically. And second is that females of some bird species can alter the sex ratio of their offspring in response to environmental conditions. So I wanted to see if there was anything going on there. I looked at all 4 of these variables in response to some commonly collected parameters regarding the individual birds, the environment, and the breeding attempt. It ended up being over 20 different variables, and the majority did not matter, so I'm going to spare you the details. Major results for participation and sex ratio, there were no major patterns. 87% of birds paired for breeding went on to participate, and we had a very even male-female ratio in the offspring. And nothing was explaining these trends any better than random. We did find some trends with nestling survival, specifically by year. It ranged quite widely from about 60% up into the mid-90s. You can see there's also a significant jump from 2017 onward, and that's probably due to some changes in husbandry practices. But in general, nestling survival is high and consistent in recent years, which is great. It also seems to be matching estimates for the wild population. Our more substantial findings centered around the hatching rate. So there was a significant variation in egg hatching rates between first and second clutches. So that's a female's first or second breeding attempt in a given year. We had 2 suspected reasons for this. One would just be physiological stress on the female. She's already laid a first clutch. But I think what's actually happening is that second clutches are disproportionately being laid by pairs that have fertility issues. I wasn't able to test this specifically because of changes to management practices in different institutions and different people doing things differently. But basically what's happening is that if the eggs are not developing, they're often removed so the pair can lay again and try again within the same season. Whereas sometimes if a pair is very successful and they raise 5 or 6 chicks to fledging, they could potentially be separated and prevented from laying another clutch. But again, this varies quite a bit from year to year, but I think this is probably what's driving this trend. The other major finding is that hatching rates in captivity are much lower than in the wild. About 50% of eggs laid in captivity hatch. In the wild, it's closer to 80%. Why this is interesting, a lot of the breeding, not all, but a lot of the breeding done in the wild is done by captive females. So to explain, in 2016, only 17 birds returned from migration. We had 4 females total, 3 of those were wild females. So we've had this loss of wild lineages, which means that a lot of the breeding that's happened at Melaleuca, especially in recent years, has been done by captive origin females. So this is potentially indicating to some extent that it's not the eggs laid by captive birds don't hatch, but that eggs laid in captivity aren't hatching. Some of the implications from this research showing that birds breed readily in captivity, and we potentially have a demographically stable captive population, which is great. Nestling survival is very high and consistent, and hatching rate. That would definitely be an area to direct future research to figure out what's going on with eggs laid in captivity. All right, my third chapter looks at the chicks themselves and what an early life in captivity might mean for their future success. For wild birds, we know that a nestling's growth and physical condition can be impacted by the environment around them. For example, how much food is available, temperature or climate extremes, brood size or hatch order. These can all influence how a chick grows. And this has been documented in many species of bird, including wild orange-bellied parrots. Another pattern that's seen is that nestlings in good physical condition might end up surviving at slightly higher rates compared to individuals that are in poorer condition, which sort of makes sense, right? They're going to have some sort of advantage. My question was about how captivity fits into this whole system. In many ways, we could argue that captivity provides a largely benign environment for growing nestlings, right? There's plenty of food, the temperature is stable, there's no predators. So how do captive chicks compare to wild chicks? And what are some of the pressures that are faced by growing nestlings? And does any of this impact them later on in life? This chapter involved a three-part analysis. The first thing I needed to do was document growth. This required repeated measurements of orange-bellied parrot nestlings every few days, from about 5 days old through to fledging, which is about day 30. These growth curves allowed us to develop a metric of body condition, what we're calling a body condition index. The second part of the analysis was to ask what impacts chick body condition. So this incorporated a lot of those same variables I mentioned earlier, so things like provenance, sex, the brood size, and the brood position. That's to indicate how much competition is between siblings. Also, again, date within the season, year, etc. With the overall question of does body condition impact the probability of survival after release? So really looking for physical predictors of survival. And this is important because low rates of migration survival is arguably what's preventing the growth of this population. For the growth functions, I had multiple measurements for 28 wild nestlings, which demeasured a couple years ago, and 192 captive nestlings. So this is a graph of wing chord, which is another way of saying wing length, as a function of age. There are 3 lines plotted there. It's a little hard to see. I was not able to physically be in 2 places at once, so we couldn't explicitly compare growth rates, but this is showing a remarkable level of consistency. The second graph is similar, but we've got body mass as a function of age. And this line is showing our growth rate for our theoretical average orange-bellied parrot nestling. And this is what's allowing us to calculate body condition. So our body condition index is very simply an individual's mass at a given age compared to this average. So positive values are above the line and negative values are below the line. For the body condition analysis, I was able to compile 6 years of records from 3 different captive breeding institutions and the wild population. This meant I had good records of age and body mass for just over 1,000 nestlings. This is a graphical results of the body condition analysis. So our dotted line at 0 represents that theoretical mean chick from the growth curve. The wild birds are shown in blue. The captive birds are shown in orange. Hopefully the colors are visible. And we had 3 different things impacting body condition. So provenance was the first one. Wild birds were generally heavier than captive birds, but there was also an impact of brood position where first hatched siblings tended to be heavier than later hatched siblings, although this was more pronounced in the wild population and it varied quite a bit by year. So for example, in 2018 and in 2021, you can see that pattern of first hatched chicks being heavier than the later hatched chicks, especially in the wild population. In the captive population, you see that trend a little bit in 2016, but from 2017 onwards, the captive population is quite consistent both across year and brood position. But the major finding from this research is showing that across almost every single year and almost every single brood position, wild birds have a higher body condition index score, which simply means that the chicks weigh more at any given age. And finally, for our survival analysis, I had 5 years of data for not quite 300 birds. The best indicator of juvenile survival, so this was the probability of surviving its first migration attempt, was body condition. So higher body condition index indicated a higher probability of surviving. Importantly, this was regardless of provenance. So captive and wild birds were equally likely to survive their first migration attempt. This is what those results look like graphically. Most of the juveniles, end up here in the middle. They survive, survival rates for them is about 25 or 30%. Those at the higher end of the body condition index, the survival rates are predicted to be closer to 50%. So this is important for two main reasons. One is we seem to have found some sort of physical predictor of survival, but it's also indicating that captive juveniles are not inherently disadvantaged. So some of the implications, the growth rates were very similar between our two populations. We also had a consistent body condition index in captivity across most years and brood positions, where the greater variability that we saw in the wild population arguably makes sense, right? Again, they need to deal with things like variation in food availability. Maybe there's a good year and a bad year, or extremes in temperature, etc. However, that being said, wild nestlings had a consistently higher body condition index compared to captive nestlings. So a future area of research would definitely be to start investigating these differences and what could be driving that trend. The other implications would be that this could be a tool to help identify release candidates, which might have a slightly better probability of surviving their first migration. All right, on to chapter 4. So continuing with our themes, right? We've done our research, we've bred birds in captivity, we've ensured that we've given them the best possible start in life, and now we want to understand how they function in the wider world after they are released. So this chapter is about orange-bellied parrot's social structure and whether an individual's social position within the population might impact its survival. A little bit of background information. As I mentioned, orange-bellied parrots are subject to intensive management. At Melaleuca, releases of adults generally occur in spring, and this has been going on for many years. This is so that the birds can pair up with individuals completing the migration and breed over the summer period. More recently, in the last 6 years or so, there's been releases of juveniles in the late summer, early autumn, and that's timed with wild nests. The good news is that generally speaking, release survival is quite high for both of these groups. The bad news is that migration survival is generally quite low. And again, low rates of survival are preventing the growth of this population. However, there's some nuance within this. We know that birds that complete the migration once are more likely to survive their subsequent attempts. This means that the first migration is the most perilous. It also means that wild adults are the most successful at migrating. It's about 60%. We just demonstrated in the last chapter that captive juveniles and wild juveniles survive at equal rates. It is lower than some historic averages, again, about 25 or 30%. But this is demonstrating that captive birds have the capacity to migrate just as well as wild birds. Captive bred adults, on the other hand, survive at extremely low rates. It's generally under 10%. And this has been the case throughout the history of the program. And I thought this was a really interesting research question because these birds are released in spring and survival through to the end of the season, so just prior to migration, is actually quite high, but migration survival is so much lower than every other group. However, these birds have got to be reasonably physically fit. They've been living in the wild for several months. They must have some degree of predator avoidance and be reasonably good at finding food. So what's going on with these adults? Is there some sort of long-term impact of an early life in captivity? To start answering these questions, I used social network analysis. So social network analysis is a way to examine population structures and understand how individuals might fit into broader group dynamics. This is a powerful tool that's kind of been underutilized in the conservation space. We think it might be appropriate for orange-bellied parrots because parrots as a group are known to be social animals. And here we have a very small population that's subjected to proportionately large fluctuations with these release events. Social structure might contribute to survival in a number of different ways. So first would be safety in numbers, right? If these birds are unable to integrate into the group, they might lose out on the safety of being in a larger flock. Additionally, there's a lot of evidence that birds can learn critical skills via information that's transmitted through their social networks. So again, this means that if released birds aren't integrated into the population or they're not hanging out with the right crowd, they might miss out on the opportunity to learn skills that might improve their survival outcomes. So let me explain a little bit about the overall system that we're working in. So orange-bellied parrots, as I mentioned, they arrive at Melaleuca either under their own power via completing a migration or fledging from a wild nest, or they're given a little bit of assistance. From there, they are free to associate with all of the birds in the population. Supplemental food is provided throughout the breeding season at 3 different locations. That means that the birds have some degree of choice in terms of who they associate with. From there, a very hardworking and dedicated team of volunteers monitor these tables for 4 hours every single day from October through to April, and they record the identity of every single bird that lands on the table. I compiled 7 years of this observational data set. Every bird in the population is banded, which means you have a high degree of certainty regarding the identity and the fate of individual birds. And we use this data to construct social networks, and I chose to focus on a 6-week period in late summer into early autumn. Within those networks, I looked at the number and strength of associations that an individual bird had. I also looked at their location within the network to determine if they were in the middle or more on the edges. And also their variation in that position through time. Is it very stable or does it change? I also looked at a metric of assortment. So that's to determine whether individuals are preferentially associating with others in the same group or potentially actively avoiding members of the same group, or if they're mixing at random. And my final question was, how do any of these variables potentially impact an individual's probability of surviving its first migration attempt? All right. There's a few different ways to parse all of these results, but in general, the major differences were between juveniles and adults. So this is an orange-bellied parrot social network. I believe it's from the 15-16 season. I know it looks like complete chaos, but the circles are individual birds. So the blue are juveniles, adults are in orange. The lines represent co-occurrence within groups, and they are scaled. So thicker lines represent stronger, more stable connections between individual birds. Generally speaking, the overall patterns that we found showed that juveniles had more and had stronger connections compared to adults. They were also more centrally located within the networks. The adults tended to be more on the edges. I know in this network, it's a little hard to tell, but statistically speaking, across all years, juveniles are more centrally located than we would expect by chance. The juveniles also displayed a greater degree in their positions through time. The adults tended to be much more variable, and there was a very high degree of assortment within these two groups. That means that juveniles were preferentially associating with other juvenile birds. Adults were preferentially associating with other adults. You'll notice I haven't been mentioning captive versus wild. That's because captive birds were socially indistinguishable from their wild colleagues. And this is indicating that there's either that the released birds are relatively well integrated into the population, and also that any long-term effects of captivity aren't being detected in the behaviors that we were able to examine. And finally, there was no impact of social metrics on survival for any group. By that, I mean that birds that were more or less centrally located or had more or less connections or were more or less stable were all equally likely to survive their first migration attempt. Some of the implications from this research is showing we have different social patterns for adults and juveniles. And this makes sense because we know that there are different migration strategies for adults and juveniles. The adults depart on their migration first, and they go in pairs and in small groups. The juveniles stay at Melaleuca and form a flock before they depart actually a few weeks later. Arguably, this is what's being reflected in our social data set. We have juveniles forming strong bonds and preferentially associating with other juvenile birds, whereas the greater variability and the weaker connections that we saw in the adults is probably because they're already starting to go on their migration. We showed that captive and wild birds are socially similar. Again, this is suggesting that they're reasonably well integrated and that any long-term impacts of captivity aren't reflected in the social behaviors that we could examine. We also showed that social metrics alone do not impact first migration survival. First migration survival was best explained by a combination of age and provenance, with captive bred adults having the lowest survival rate of any group, like we discussed at the beginning. This makes me wonder if there's some sort of important social or learning period for juvenile birds. Maybe the captive adults are trying to migrate like adults, but they've never done the route as a juvenile. We don't know. There's a lot we don't know about orange-bellied parrot migration in terms of exactly where they go or how they're using the landscape. So this is definitely an area to direct future research. All right, my last chapter. It's not about orange-bellied parrots. It's about swift parrots. Specifically, it's about understanding how everything I've studied and researched throughout this PhD can be directly applied to other species to help inform management decisions with evidence. I'm not going to spend ages on background. What you need to know is that swift parrots are critically endangered and they are declining at alarming rates. This is a graph published by Giselle Owens just last year. You'll have to go and read her paper to understand all of the different models, but this is a population viability analysis for swift parrots, and it's showing a precipitous rate of decline, right? We have population size by year. So you can clearly see the wild population of swift parrots is tracking towards extinction very quickly. We know the major causes of this decline include timber harvesting, which is leading to ongoing loss of critical breeding habitat, but also predation from introduced sugar gliders. For those of us who are interested in preserving swift parrots in the wild and preventing extinction, one of the major questions that's sort of being bandied about at the moment is how could a captive breeding program, like the orange-bellied parrot one, for example, potentially contribute to recovery of this species? To start answering that question, we need to understand a little bit about swift parrots. So we know they are critically endangered. Current population estimate is somewhere around 500 birds, and that is declining. We know they breed in Tasmania and migrate to the mainland over winter. They're also nomadic and extremely wide-ranging across both their breeding and wintering range, so they move around in response to food availability. Now, there are two other species that share some similar characteristics that have long-term breed for release programs, specifically talking about the orange-bellied parrot and the Regent honeyeater program. Both have very small populations, both declining, and they both share life history characteristics which can help inform swift parrot management. So for OBPs, like swift parrots, they breed in Tasmania and migrate to the mainland. However, orange-bellied parrots are a little bit bizarre because the whole population is banded and they conveniently turn up at the exact same place every single year. Regents, on the other hand, they are nomadic and wide-ranging across a huge area, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So this is going to give us really important information on monitoring and implementing a program across such a huge geographic scale. For the captive populations, the OBPs started in 1986 with 10 initial founders, currently houses somewhere around 600 birds. The Regent program started about 10 years later in 1995 with an initial founder collection of 9 birds, so currently just shy of 200 birds in captivity. So my idea was let's build the OBP and the Regent program for swift parrots and see what that can do to help the wild population. So to do this, I constructed a PVA and vortex, and I built 2 captive populations. One I'm calling small, which was about 200 birds, and one that I'm calling large, which was just over 600. So this is mimicking the Regent and the OBP programs respectively. My captive population started at 44 individual swift parrots, and this was informed directly from the current swift parrot studbook. So these are birds that are housed in managed institutions, because I'm really interested in grounding this research in reality. Like if we started this tomorrow, what could it maybe look like? I then constructed 3 different release and harvest scenarios. So scenario 1 was about releasing as many birds as possible. This released 60% of juveniles produced in the captive populations annually. The reason I chose 60% was because if I set it any higher, the captive populations would generally fail to increase and therefore provide less birds for release overall. Scenario 2, we're still releasing a lot of birds, so 40% of juveniles, but this time we're harvesting 20 founders from the wild to invest in the captive population a little bit. And my third scenario is very similar, releasing 40% of juveniles, but this time we're harvesting 60 founders from the wild, so over the first 5 years of the program. So this is representing a significant attempt to gather a lot of genetic diversity from the wild, which is important when you're considering the long-term genetic and demographic management of a captive population. I wasn't able to incorporate too much genetic management specifically into my models, but as you can tell from the Regent and the OBP programs, which both had initial founder intakes of about 10, harvesting 60 birds is certainly a significant attempt to gather a lot of genetic diversity. And finally, I wanted to incorporate estimates of costs. So as we saw from the review chapter, these are rarely reported, but I was super interested to get estimates because I think this is an important component to consider. I was able to find some budget estimates published from both the OBP and the Regent program. So this included costs related to the captive program, so housing birds and also infrastructure costs, releases, post-release monitoring, and an estimate of salaries. It's probably a little bit rough, but at least it's a starting point. And finally, the timeline. I ran this program for 30 years. That's about 3 times the amount of time that swift parrots have left. And it's about as long as the Regent and the OBP programs have been running, which has been 30 and 40 years respectively. That being said, I set the model to withdraw supplementation after 20 years. So again, this is reflecting the idea of let's jump in the deep end, start releasing birds straight away. What could we do in a 20-year time frame? These are the results of those models. So we've got the small captive population on the top row, the large captive population on the bottom row. Each captive population is shown by the solid black line, and the corresponding dashed black line is the wild population that's subjected to each of our 3 release scenarios. The dotted line, which is in red, but I don't know if you can see it, that's Giselle Owen's original models. So this is the wild population with no action, and I've just repeated it in every facet for reference. So you can see in scenario 1 on the left-hand side, that's the release as many birds as possible strategy. The captive populations never actually make it to carrying capacity while the releases are ongoing. That's why we have this sudden jump in the captive populations at year 20 when releases stop. Because that scenario is so focused on releases, the scenario is maintaining the wild population of swift parrots at slightly higher levels. It's about 80 in the small population and about 220 for the large population. This one does look like a big ski jump, but it is maintaining. It's not continuing to increase. For scenarios 2 and 3, the harvesting of founders from the wild does have a negative impact on the wild population. You can see it a bit in scenario 3 where the dashed black line actually dips down below the red because we're harvesting 60 founders in that scenario. However, because we harvested all of those founders, the captive population in scenario 3 does grow quite a bit faster. This means that even though it starts with a more negative trend, by the end of 20 years, scenario 2 and 3 basically end up in the same place, maintaining at about 60 wild swift parrots in the small and about 150 in the large population. However, the major takeaway here is that when we remove supplementation at year 20, all of the populations crash. The probability of extinction for the wild population is shown in the top corner of every graph, and it ranges from a high of about 62% probability of extinction down to about a 12% probability of extinction, but it's certainly not an encouraging trend. So what have we actually done in these scenarios for the small population? Depending on the scenario, we've released somewhere between 450 and nearly 700 birds over a 20-year period. That leads us with a predicted wild population at year 30 of either 7 or 9 individual birds. Costs for those programs range somewhere between $42 and $45 million over a 30-year period. For the large populations, we released a lot more birds, well over 1,000, nearly 1,400 birds for the first scenario. That leads us with a predicted wild population of about 15 birds by year 30. The cost estimates in this scenario are much higher. This is mostly due to the larger captive population and all the associated salaries, ranging from between $105 to $118 million over a 30-year period. Some of the takeaway messages from this research, so not surprisingly, captive breeding and releases alone cannot recover swift parrots in the absence of addressing threats that are faced by the wild population. We're arriving at a point where the number of birds released is equal to the mortality rate. So this is not a viable long-term strategy on its own without addressing the causes of decline in the first place. However, it can play a part. It can definitely buy time. And this is an important consideration. So for the OBPs, for example, in the early 1980s, they could see a decline was happening, but didn't understand what was happening or why, and therefore did not have a good idea as to how to address it. So pulling birds into captivity was really an insurance population. And we can argue that this appears to have worked, right? They have not gone extinct. However, that was 40 years ago. These programs represent significant long-term investments, and we must balance the costs of these hypothetical programs against the cost of addressing the threats in the wild, especially because for swift parrots, we do have a solid understanding of what the threats are causing the declines. It's also showing that existing programs can really help inform planning and contribute to evidence-based decision-making. A lot of the model parameters in terms of reproduction, survival, the monitoring information, and the costs came directly from the OBP and the Regent programs. A lot came directly from research I did during my PhD. I also spent a ton of time combing through gray literature. I read recovery plans and government documents, internal reports. A lot of this information wasn't super easy to get. I had to make very specific requests to very specific people. Sometimes that could take months. And it can be difficult to know what information to ask for if you're not sure what information even exists in the first place. So this really ties back to the importance of that literature review way back at the start, right? Publishing information on what did or did not work or methods that had been trialed can be really important. So other programs might be able to make more informed decisions about what they want to try and also generate reasonable expectations. So no one needs to reinvent the wheel. All right, we're finally at the end. So in conclusion, we've shown that captive breeding programs, when they're used as a tool for species conservation, don't seem to be well represented in the literature, broadly speaking. Especially the mechanics of how these programs actually operate really don't seem to be there. To me, this highlights the need to work collaboratively across that sort of in situ, ex situ spectrum. And we can't do this in isolation, right? We know that captive breeding certainly isn't always the most appropriate strategy. There are a lot of challenges to these programs, as we have seen. But if it is pursued as a conservation strategy, again, we can't work in isolation. And we showed this both with the OBPs and the swift parrots, right? We need to respect that there are a lot of different elements and different pieces involved. This is going to require a lot of different fields of expertise. So we can't work on one tiny element and risk losing sight of the bigger picture. We need to make our management decisions based on evidence, right? We have limited time, limited money, limited birds, and limited resources. So if the information is not available, that can be a very difficult thing to do. And just in general, it makes me want to kind of drag all of this out into the light and start having really open and transparent discussions around how these strategies can be used in an effective way. All right, that is everything.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
And those that needed to leave at 1 o'clock, you better run away. It's 7
Thank
past.
you for staying.
Thanks for staying. Now that's the chat, right?
Yep.
That's the microphone for people in the room to be picked up for people on Zoom to hear.
Roger that. Have we got any questions for Laura? Yes, I can't throw because gay, so I'm just going to give you this.
Okay. Okay. Laura, I was just wondering about the success of migration. Do we know how many actually survive the first migration or may die in the before they come back in the for the second migration?
Yeah, so whether it's happening from Tasmania to Victoria or
Yep.
from Victoria
Yeah.
to Tasmania, we don't have a good understanding of that yet. There are a lot of people in Victoria who do survey for birds, and we'll see birds reported on the mainland. But just as often we have birds that are never seen on the mainland, but they turn up the next year. So we still don't have a great understanding of exactly where in the process these mortalities are occurring. There is some exciting research that Tasmanian state government is involved in that's starting to track birds a little bit more on the migration. So hopefully we'll get some more answers, but yeah, still an unknown at this stage.
Sorry.
Thanks, Laura. That was really interesting. So what I take with the orange-bellied parrots is that in some ways, the captive bred individuals measure up to the wild ones, but where there's a difference, normally being captive is not so great. There's a downside to being captive, and I understand the kind of the effects you can have in a captive population. But one you didn't talk about that I kept wondering about is the diet. I mean, they're not eating a wild diet, they're eating something else. You might expect that in general, we could actually make these birds fatter and healthier in captivity than in the wild. But the fact that that ultimately they're better off being wild, do we know how well, or do we know whether or not diet plays any role in that, or how well we're able to replicate the kind of diet they need to be at their best?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I initially had a note and then it got cut as I was way over time initially. But I think that's probably the most likely, or at least that's the logical place to start in terms of we've shown that they seem to be growing at very similar rates. Genetically, we know it's basically one big meta population. So, I mean, it could be something like gut bacteria or provisioning behavior from the parents, but diet is certainly an obvious place. Moses is starting to preliminary steps into looking into some techniques that might start answering some of those questions. But yeah, at this point, like the captive diet is based on recommendations from like veterinarians and nutritionists, and theoretically they're growing just as well. But yeah, we don't have a good understanding as to why. Yeah.
In about a month's time.
Yeah.
Month?
Wait for
Moses will be presenting his honours talk.
That was brilliant, Laura. Well done. I was just wondering, when you were talking about the social network stuff there, am I right in you said that the juveniles kind of are on their own and don't necessarily migrate at the same time as the adults, right? So basically, could it be the case that through releasing juveniles, there's actually more juveniles migrating together in bigger flocks, right? And then they have kind of more optimal collective decision making, able to kind of collectively navigate better. Could that explain things potentially?
Quite possibly. I mean, it's one of the weird things, well, what I think is a little bit strange is that as far as we know for the adults, they go in dribs and drabs and they only ever go in pairs and in small groups. And that doesn't seem like a great strategy, but that seems to be even back from the early writings in the mid-1980s. That's the descriptions. The adults go first, they go in small groups, the juveniles stay and form a big flock, and then they go sort of in bigger groups. Yeah, and from what I've read, migratory birds will often have different strategies between juveniles, subadults, adults. They're all kind of doing slightly different things, slightly different timing. But I guess what we don't understand is how those differences are impactful in terms of their future success.
It's just there's a lot of experimental work with pigeons that shows that if you release home pigeons in a big flock, they take a much more efficient route back.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether there's kind of a similar mechanism going.
Could be. And yeah, I've read something similar, I think, with ibis. Yeah, in terms of where they're released and the group size. And again, this is also tying back to my lit review, like getting people to publish. How did you release them? How many did you release? Did you trial big groups versus small groups?
The reason
Yeah.
I'm saying this is we're trying to encourage the regions to consider releasing the juvenile. They've got this thing in the captivity, year old and develop these things in captivity before they're fit enough to survive in the wild. But could it be, I guess, having the ability to collectively navigate is subtly different to being released at a young age and having the ability to learn things that actually need to survive in the wild. So that would be interesting to try and partition.
Yeah.
Where it's just literally numbers for the opportunity to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a super interesting space.
There's just a lot of congratulations online, no
Oh,
question.
thank you.
Any other questions in the room?
Thank you, everyone.
Sorry, it's like that.
So one more. Just the really general, like your observation that nobody writes it up, nobody shares their information, and it's really frustrating because you can't learn from all these things that have happened. The practitioners are not in academic institutions, they're not scientific institutions, they're very practically oriented, so their culture is not to write up scientific papers. So what can we do about that? Is there a way of sort of starting a new culture of perhaps, big databases where everybody signs up and says, I'm not going to write a paper, but we're going to answer all these questions on an online database, put it all in one place, and then those who are inclined to look at it and write it up and learn, have somewhere to go. Is there anything like that where we could actually pull everybody together in a different way and not necessarily through scientific literature?
Yeah, and I think that's sort of where I'm going with this, because everyone, like, this is my day job at the same time. So everyone I work with is extremely smart, extremely dedicated, very experienced. They're trying to make the best decisions with the information they have, and they're reaching out to professional networks. But when you're, arguably outside on the academic side, it's a very different picture. And I think it's detrimental that we can't sort of bridge that gap and we're sort of working independently, because you do need people with different skills and different techniques. So yeah, I'm not sure. I think there are spaces where that sort of information is becoming available, not so much in this field, but it's certainly, I think there's some models we could potentially start following. Yeah.
Anyone else? I think we should give Laura an applause for the way to go. Thanks for
Right. Thank you, everyone.
issues. And thanks for fixing them, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Steve.